Just a few details before we get started. This presentation is designed only for students eligible under IDEA. This session will focus primarily on the decision points for students and families that are entitled to special education services. This session will be recorded and posted on the Patent website. If there are questions, there is the possibility to put questions in the Q&A. And at the end of the session, after I go over the information, I will do my best to respond to the questions. So to get started, Governor Wolf approved Act 66 less than a week ago. And we recognize at BSC that there are some very critical decisions that families need to make, or guardians or students with disabilities need to make. So we want to offer this time to provide some clarity to the guidance which was posted earlier this week and to field questions at the end of the presentation. So again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. Over the past year and a half, there has been a lot of concern regarding how to address the needs of some of our students with disabilities that may have had difficulty accessing FAPE, a free and appropriate public education, in the same manner due to the health and safety concerns imposed by the pandemic. The intent of Act 66 is to ensure that school-age students with and without disabilities do not lose educational opportunities due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This has been a concern over the past year and a half of PDE and BSC, and we proactively have addressed the concerns through a few initiatives I want to make sure everyone watching this is aware of. The Bureau of Special Education initiated the COVID compensatory services, which is where conversations should be being had at the LEA level to discuss if students with disabilities eligible under IDEA are in need of additional services to make up for any lost skills or potential lack of meaningful progress imposed by the pandemic. And these conversations may have occurred last year or may be starting to occur when the school year opens. It's really based on how open the school system was based on the transmission rate. But that's one process in place to try to support students with disabilities to make up for lost skills or lack of meaningful progress. A second initiative out of PDE to support the learning loss of all students will start as the school year opens, and is known as the Accelerated Learning through Scaffolded Supports. And the intent of this initiative is to support all students to enter school with an array of support systems to support them to make up for any lost skills that may have occurred due to the pandemic. Both of these initiatives are to address the learning loss or lack of progress of all students. This information can be found on the PDE website, and I would encourage all families to review this information as part of your decision-making process. It is beginning to feel good coming through the pandemic and that we're turning a corner. And hopefully once these important decisions are made, we can continue to get back on track of a more familiar educational experience. Before moving on, I do need to emphasize that this presentation and guidance is a reflection of the Bureau of Special Education and the Pennsylvania Department of Education's recommendations for the implementation of the Act. However, it is not legal advice, it is guidance. There are multiple ways to access this guidance and this information in the form. This particular screenshot is of the Bureau of Special Education website. The information can be found in our COVID update section. And if you click on that link, it takes you to the next screen. This screen is Pennsylvania Department of Education's landing page for the Act 66 of 2021 guidance. And it is also the location of the form, which is available in English and in Spanish. One important note is that if you are choosing to submit the form, it needs to be submitted to your school district. Do not submit to the Pennsylvania Department of Education. The first page of this guidance describes the intent of the law, and it separates the action between two different sets of students. Students that may be repeating a grade and students that may be returning for an additional year. The difference in these two sets of students is that there are students repeating a grade refers to any student that is going to be retained. They may be students with or without disabilities. Whereas the group of students that are staying additional year only refers to the students eligible under IDEA that turned 21 during the 2020-21 school year and have aged out. These students with disabilities would have traditionally aged out after the school term in which they turned 21. And this is the only group of students afforded the option to stay beyond the school term in which they turn 21 for this upcoming school year only. Again, these students eligible under IDEA that turn 21 during the 2021 school year or the summer between the end of the school year and the beginning of the 21-22 school year. These are the students that traditionally would have aged out and are the only group the law permits to return beyond the age 21 for this upcoming school year only. So on to the guidance. Who are the students that this law pertains to in a little bit more detail? Does this law permit preschoolers to repeat a year? No, the law allows students to repeat a grade level, and preschool is not considered a grade level. If a student has met graduation requirements, meaning a student with disability met Chapter 4 graduation requirements or met their IEP goals and objectives, should they repeat a grade level? The Bureau's recommendation is that if students with disabilities met Chapter 4 graduation requirements or achieved their goals and objectives, they have not experienced the learning loss and therefore need to regain or make up skills and therefore should move on with their transition goals as the transition plan is designed. We would not recommend that this particular group of student repeat a grade or return for more time. But what if a student with disability decides to stay an additional year, but they already received their diploma solely by aging out? Our recommendation is that if a student received the diploma solely by aging out and they need time to receive more services to meet their goals and objectives, these are the students that should return for an additional year. Does this law require school entities to provide extended school year services during the summer of 2022 to those students with disabilities who stayed an additional year? Because the law requires school entities to implement the most recent IEPs of those students who stay an additional year, if that student's most recent IEP contains extended school year services, then the schools should provide those services over the summer 2022. What if a student with a disability who has reached the age of majority is unable to provide consent to stay an additional year? This is not a new phenomenon. There are times when students turn 21 during the school year, and therefore transfer of rights go to that student. And whatever the processes typically were for parents to secure the ability to consent for their student, they should be following those processes and procedures. The special education process and how it relates to Act 66. Act 66 articulates that the school entity shall make all steps necessary to comply with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. What this means that either the returning students are still entitled to all the protections and rights afforded under IDEA, the Individuals with Education Act. Should the decision to repeat a grade level or stay an additional year be made by IEP teams? The law articulates that for the decision to repeat a grade, the law indicates the decision is to be made by a parent or the guardian for students under 18 years of age and by the student who is at or over 18 years of age. And for the decision to help to remain an additional year, the law indicates the decision is to be made by a parent or a guardian or student. So the law places the decision within the hands of the parent or the guardian or the student. However, it would be inappropriate for the Bureau of Special Education to recommend that any decision regarding a student with disability be made in isolation without data or without information. We recognize the timeline is very tight and it would be very difficult to pull IEP teams together. So that isn't necessarily our recommendation. But our recommendation is that all decisions be made in conjunction with the IEP after review of data. What that means is we are highly recommending that parents or guardians or students with disabilities are making informed decisions and gathering information, particularly as it relates to retention, to ensure that they have the information that they need to make this very important decision. This could mean a call to the school system, talking to the director of special education, talking to the case manager if they happen to be available, just to make sure that you have all the information necessary, making this very critical decision, particularly as it relates to retention of your student with disability. The Bureau would never recommend that decisions are made in isolation. The next question, must a local education agency revise IEPs for students with disabilities or repeating a grade level or staying an additional year? IEPs should be revised in accordance with the circumstances set forth within the law. So what that means is if the only thing that changes is an action imposed by Act 16, the student is retained or the student returns, but the most current IEP is put into place, there isn't a need to revise the IEP. Act 66 does not require action through the IEP process. However, if services were to change, just like in any circumstances for students that receive special education services, if services need to be adjusted or the IEP team does need to come together and revise something, it's at that time the IEP would be revised if services are being adjusted in some form, but not solely because of the an act under Act 66. That conversation is very parallel to do reevaluations need to be completed. Reevaluations should occur in accordance with circumstances set forth within the law. So if the triannual or the biannual are due, the team should come together and determine if there needs to be a review of records, if there needs to be additional data, if a waiver is appropriate, anything within the law and the process should occur as it has in the past. There is not an additional action that needs to be occur because of Act 66. The question regarding must LEAs issue notice of recommended educational placement or prior written notice solely if students decide to repeat a grade or stay an additional year? Again, solely due to an action under Act 66 does not warrant an issuance of a notice of recommended educational placement or prior written notice. However, if services were to substantially change, at that moment, a NORAP may need to be issued. This is certainly a circumstance we would recommend LEAs seek solicitor guidance. But there is not a need to issue a NORAP if parents are choosing to retain their child, because that is not necessarily an action the local education agency is recommending. So that concludes the presentation of the majority of the information that is on the guidance. On this Q&A section, there is a RA email account. If there are additional questions after this presentation, you may submit it to this RA account and it will be responded to, or I will have an advisor reach out to a family if there's a particular individual concern. There has also been questions regarding interagency collaboration and how might this decision impact adult services. So there is a webinar on the Peel website that the Bureau of Special Education, Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, and Office of Developmental Programs did concurrently together in collaboration that really talks about these decision points and this intersection of services and how they interact. So we would first encourage families to watch this webinar to gain a better understanding of how that intersection occurs between adult services and school age services and when the right time is for transition. And if you have particular questions related to waiver access or impact or OVR case management access in adult services, we would encourage you to reach out to your support coordinators for those particular questions. And lastly, on this page is the HUNE website, which is a parent support organization that partners with the Bureau of Special Education that works with their Spanish-speaking families. They have provided some support mechanisms on their website for our Spanish-speaking families, and the link is also there. Okay, so at this point, I am going to respond to some questions. There is a question regarding translation. So just like in any other circumstance, local education agencies will need to translate the documents into the languages that represent their particular community. I'm reading the next question. Okay, so here is a question that says, what does it mean to repeat a grade level in high school since there's not a set number of classes per year, but only requirements for graduation? A family of a student with disability may want the student to repeat a grade level for social, emotional, behavioral reasons, not academic reasons. May the student retain credits and grades from the 2020-2021 academic year and have a free rein to take other appropriate classes. So the concept of credits, the concept of grades are all local decisions. So if you have concerns or need information regarding transcripts, grades, credits, we encourage you to talk to your local school system. There's a question regarding how will accelerated learning be provided? Will this be based on each student's needs or provided generally to the entire classroom reviewing information? So first, I would encourage you to review the accelerated learning with scaffolded supports on the PDE website. It will give you a broad, big picture of the recommendations and the systems that and the framework that school systems are developing. The accelerated learning targets academics. It targets social emotional learning. It uses data-based decision-making, and it uses scaffolded supports because we recognize and the LEAs recognize that students had all different experiences during this pandemic. And we need to be prepared to address all of the students within the classrooms as they enter based on all the different needs they may have, particularly in the area of social emotional during this transition. So this accelerated learning is designed with a universal design principle, knowing that students will be all different levels and how can we address them through scaffolded supports. It will start with class-wide supports, and it then will tailor down to individual supports based on the scaffolded system. But I would encourage you to first review the PDE website, and then second, reach out to your LEA and talk to them about their accelerated learning model to gain more details, particularly as it relates to your LEA. I'm reading the next question, excuse me one second. So the question is relating to our guidance regarding the IEP process and the timing of the IEP process, and what if the school district is unable to have an IEP meeting. I have to reiterate, I think the timeline is very tight, and it would be very challenging over the next 2 weeks to pull an IEP team together. And if the LEA is able to do so, kudos to them, because the timeline is very tough, and we all know how difficult it is to get schedules together. So knowing the high difficulty that it would be to have that happen, we are just encouraging parents to gain information, making these decisions, and reach out to your school system. Make a phone call, call your director of special education, your supervisor of special education, send an email so you can gather information, particularly as it relates to retention when you're making that decision, so it's informed. But it would be very difficult to pull IEP teams together to have this conversation. So we are more recommending you pull parties that are part of the team to give you information as you are making this decision. Okay, so here is a question. If the extra school year applies only to those that are 21 in the 2021 school year and provides an extra year to other students who are repeating, how are students with IEPs that aren't 21 going to add an extra year of education, gain an extra year of education? So at this point, Act 66 only affords an extra year of education for those students that had turned 21 and traditionally aged out. For students with disabilities that may have had difficulty accessing FAPE in the same manner during the pandemic, that's what the COVID compensatory services are for, adding additional services, adding additional time of services, either over the summers coming up for the next couple of years, before school, after school, additional summertime days in addition to extended school year, conversations through agreements with school systems that may look even different than that. But for these students that may have had difficulty accessing services the same way, COVID compensatory services is a way to add additional services to those students. There is a question regarding transition programs. Does an Act 66 apply to the students age 21 transition programs? A student was in a outside of the district program, but there are a limited number of spots, and they may not be able to service the students who are choosing to stay an extra year. This is a concern that we are hearing about, that students that were in a transition program, the spots are limited. The program has planned and have bring other students into the spots. In those particular scenarios, we are asking the program or the LEA to contact their special education advisor, and we're going to help support them through this. So I don't have a response to that right now, but we are experiencing that dynamic, and we are looking to brainstorm how to resolve that issue with the particular LEA and the program that is experiencing it. If my younger student repeats a year, would they still be required to leave by 21, or would that extend to age 22? Act 66 is only permitting students that are currently 21 and traditionally would have aged out to return beyond that for this school year only. So for this moment in time, Act 66 is only extending a year for the current students that had turned 21 during the 2021 school year or the summer between last school year and the starting of the 21-22 school year. There was a question of what if a graduation NORAP was issued? Doesn't the IEP team meeting need to be held and another IEP developed for the 2021 school year? In this circumstance, the law indicates that the student's most current IEP should be implemented. So the Bureau's recommendation is that if there is a returning 21-year-old that traditionally would have aged out, that the most current IEP be implemented. Now, if there was a graduation NORAP issued because the student was aging out, that would be a significant change, meaning there was a NORAP recommending a graduation and the ending of special education services. The student may be returning. The student would be implementing the most current IEP. In that circumstance, districts may want to reissue the NORAP to reinstate the services, but that's a circumstance we would recommend that LEAs seek solicitor guidance. There is a question, what if a parent elects to have their student retained for a year and then changes their mind later in the summer? The law, Act 66 does not speak to that. We would recommend that if parents are questioning or unsure about retention, that they reach out to their LEA to have a conversation before making the decision. We would recommend that parents do research on the impact of retention on students before making that decision. Search websites, search educational websites or journals or so on, just so that they are aware of what the research says regarding retention, have conversations with their LEAs before making the decision. And if they are uncertain, I would have a conversation with your particular LEA regarding, what if I'm unsure? Can I change my mind before school starts? There's a question regarding, when do school districts need to put information on Act 66 on their website? There was not a required deadline for them to do that. There was a recommendation from PDE that they link to the PDE website, but there was not a timeline requirement for them to do so. There's a question, if a student currently has a 40-10 slot in an approved private school under this law, will the student retain the 40-10 slot and placement? So what this person means regarding a 40-10 slot is that there is a law that supports approved private schools to share funding between the LEA and the state for students that go to some approved private schools. This law does not speak to the 40-10 slots. And in summary, if the most current IEP indicates that the student was receiving services in that particular area, in that particular approved private school, in all intention, the student should return to receive the services there. Regarding the funding, we are having that conversation at the state to determine the impact of that, and we will follow up with guidance regarding the funding piece of it with LEAs directly, because it just really impacts LEAs and the state. However, we also are hearing some concerns very similar to the transition programs that the spaces at the private schools, at the approved private schools, regardless of the 40-10 slot or not, are limited. So again, we are going to work with the approved private schools and the impacted LEAs to try to support them through that process. There's a question regarding an additional year for the students that are under 21. At this moment in time, Act 66 only affords the current students that aged out of last school year, that turned 21, either last school year or over the summer, to return for an additional year. There's a question, is the state providing additional funding to support this legislation? Actually, the federal government has supplied a significant amount of educational funding over the past couple of months that can be used to support these students that are returning. So yes, there is additional federal funds that are flowing through the states directly to the LEAs, the ESSER $3 as part of the ARP Recovery Act, the American Recovery Plan, that can be used and that should be used to support the additional costs of this act. There's a question regarding, isn't Act 66 to address the students' learning loss during the 2021 school year, and CCS is just for the time between April and May 19 April and May, and I think they mean 2019 to 2020. So when the Bureau came out with the COVID compensatory services guidance a year ago, it was when we were all optimistic and thinking that we would be opening school and everybody would be opening school at the same time and students would be transitioning and the process could be consistent across LEAs. But we know that the pandemic had a different plan for all of us across the world. So as a result, across Pennsylvania, schools were on all different timelines and circumstances. In certain areas of the state, they were able to open up and remain open for almost the entire school year without interruption, and students were able to consistently receive services. In other areas of the state where the transmission rate was very high and health and safety was a higher concern, they were unable to open up and provide in-person services the same way that they were prior to the pandemic. So as a result, the eligibility or the process for determining COVID compensatory services really was unique to each LEA in each circumstance and how the pandemic has impacted the particular district's ability to offer FAPE during this time. The Bureau intends to provide additional guidance regarding COVID compensatory services prior to the start of the school year. The Office of Special Education Programs out of the Federal Office for Special Education Programs has indicated that they intend to provide some guidance regarding compensatory services to the states. We're intending to receive that shortly. We want to receive that information. and then provide that information and additional information to the LEAs prior to the opening of school, which can address some of these concerns and how this process can occur when schools reopen a little bit more consistently for everyone. The form states that even if a student has passed the grade, parents have the option to retain their students. But the Bureau's recommendation is that students should not repeat a grade if they met their goals. Can a district deny the request from parents? The law provides the authorities to the parents. This guidance is PDE and the Bureau's recommendations based on our interpretation of the intent of the law, but the law affords the authority and the decision-making to the parents. Is the accelerated learning and scaffolded supports a type of best practice PDE plans to encourage to do, or is it a type of COVID learning loss makeup plan that skills will in fact be implementing as an alternative to retention? So the accelerated learning and scaffolded supports is both best practice in the PD's perspective and in a framework for LEAs to address the learning loss and develop a plan for all students to support students to make up lost skills or support their social and mental well-being as we reopen school. There have been a series of trainings that have been available to all LEAs and our intermediate units that regionally will be supporting the implementation of these plans to all LEAs across the Commonwealth. This is a very intentional and systemic approach of PDE to support all of our students across the Commonwealth that may have been impacted. So there is a framework, there is guidance, there are trainings on all of these areas. It's very robust that you could see on the PDE website, and is designed with support for all LEAs to implement this through our intermediate units. So it's PDE's intention that LEAs are planning and developing an accelerated learning plan with scaffolded supports, and there are funds associated with this to support them to do so. There's a question that says, I indicated that 18 and older can make the decision to repeat a grade level. Don't parents retain educational decision-making for special education students until they graduate? It's a very great question that's a little bit complicated. So regarding enrollment in school for all students, enrollment in school, 18-year-olds are able to have the decision-making authority to enroll or not enroll in school. Under IDEA, parents maintain the decision-making authority regarding the offering of FAPE and delivery of services up until the time that student turns 21. There's a question related to what's the recommendation for gifted students who have met their goals but parents want to retain. I think I would just say the same thing that I have said. If parents are considering retention, we first would recommend, if they've met their goals and they've passed their classes, they continue to progress through their educational experience. The intent of this law was to support students that were negatively impacted due to the pandemic. However, if parents are still considering retention for what personal reasons, we would encourage them to do their research on retention, and we would encourage them to reach out and have conversations with their school systems. The question is, where would I find information on the COVID compensatory services? Early on, I showed you the link to the Bureau of Special Education website. If you would just type in Pennsylvania Bureau of Special Education, it would take you to our landing page. On the landing page, there is a gray box that has COVID resources. All of our guidance over the past year is posted on that website, and we would encourage you to review that information. I also provided an email account that Sarah can put back into the chat for a special education RA account. That special education RA account is a valuable resource to parents. Parents put a concern in there. It comes directly to me. I read every single email that goes into that account. And based on the individual concerns that parents may have, we will then have a Bureau of Special Education advisor reach out to that parent. They can reach out to that parent to field any questions, to discuss any of their concerns. If the parent would like a bridge to the LEA, the advisor then can reach out to the LEA to support a communication between the home and school and connect the parents and the school together, and maybe help solve any confusions or misunderstandings that may be occurring. So I would also recommend the use of the RA email account if there are individual questions or concerns that you may have regarding your student. And some of those questions that are coming into the Q&A session that are really student specific, I would recommend, though, if I don't respond to them, those very individual student specific questions, you put the question into the RA account and the Bureau will follow up with you. So there's a question is there anything available for students that turned 21 during the 1920 school year that had difficulty during the last 3 months of schools when the pandemic first hit? The recommendation for those particular students would be that they would, if the families are having concerns with the progress of their students, if the student is having difficulty with a successful transition based on not having the same services at the end of the school year, we would recommend that the IEP team come together, that the family reach out to the school system and the team come together and discuss if there's a need for compensatory services. So there is the option for compensatory services to be offered to families, particularly those students that aged out in the 1920 school year that may need some additional supports to support a successful transition into the adult world. There's a question, can APSs deny programming if they do not have capacity? What I'm going to say is that we do understand that there are capacity issues. So if there is an APS that's struggling due to capacity issues, we are going to try to work with that particular LEA and that approved private school to see if we could support that process. So that would be our recommendation, that if there's a particular scenario regarding a shortage of space, that they reach out to the Bureau. There's a couple of questions regarding, are there certain date requirements for LEAs to comply with translation, to comply with posting things on the website, to comply with other asks? The only date requirement that was put into the law was the July 15th deadline for the submission of the form. There is a question regarding state reporting. If a school district has already reported a student as a graduate or a particular grade through the July reporting, and there has been some changes, we are going to be, the Bureau will be supported with LEAs, and we will support some adjustments, whatever adjustments need to be made. So we'll be working directly with LEAs, communicating through the PAIU group on how to support those changes, but we are aware there would be changes, and we will be flexible and support the LEAs through this process. There's a question if an LEA can refuse to allow a student to repeat a grade or attend the additional year if they aged out. If not, what would a parent do? If there's a circumstance of a student that is aging out and a parent is requesting the student return, and for whatever reason the district is not supporting the parent's ask, in those circumstances, we would say we would be willing to support the conversation. They could put something into the RA account, and we could have an advisor reach out to the parent and support that conversation. There's a question regarding are some of these concerns able to be put through the Office of Dispute Resolutions? The Office of Dispute Resolutions is an option afforded under students that are eligible under IDEA through the procedural safeguards, and any issue related to the Individuals with Disabilities Act or Chapter 14, even for the students that traditionally would have aged out, they are still entitled to those processes and procedural safeguards. There's a question regarding, can these forms be submitted electronically? That is a conversation for the local education agency. Electronic signatures, the permission regarding electronic signatures would be dependent upon this local education's policy on electronic signatures. There are questions regarding parent requesting the student to be retained or to extend their learning for the aged out 21-year-olds, and what to do if a district is refusing. And I would just reiterate that the law is providing the opportunity for parents to make the decision. The Bureau and PDE are recommending certain things based on best practice and research. So if there are families that are having some challenges, we would hope the LEAs would be working with the parents, and that if there continue to be concerns for students with disabilities, I would recommend that they put something into the email account and we can support that conversation. Okay. So a couple questions are related to the additional year. I can only reiterate that Act 66 has only extended eligibility for 1 year for the students that turned 21 last school year or are turning 21 during the summer before the start of this upcoming school year. So there are questions regarding the COVID compensatory services agreements that may have already been in place. This has been a question that has been brought to the Bureau most recently, and we intend to respond to or provide some recommendations in our next set of COVID compensatory services guidance. But between now and then, we would recommend you consult with your solicitor regarding that circumstance. There's a question regarding the timeline and why there was such a short notice. The law was passed last Thursday. So it's been four days since the passing of the law. So we have done the best we could be to be responsive to this timeline. Okay, so I have responded to, oh, one more. So there's a question regarding moving students, if students move from district to district during this decision-making period, and they're unsure about where they're moving. We would recommend you just speak directly to the district in which you're enrolling and explain your circumstance and try to work with them regarding if you are choosing to retain your student or not. That would be the same if you were in state or out of state. Our recommendation would be to talk to the LEA in which you're enrolling. There's a question on why preschool students are not considered under Act 66. Preschool is not a grade. Therefore, they are not included within this law. This does not negate the Act 30 law, which permits students that have not hit a particular age to continue to stay in early intervention 1 additional year. So that law is still intact, meaning if students have not aged out of early intervention, that law is still intact. They may stay in early intervention according to the Act 30 law. However, it does not permit students, preschool students, to stay in addition. They must transition to school and school age services. I think I've responded to most of the questions I feel I'm able to respond to at this moment. Some of the questions are student specific. So if I have not responded, I would just recommend you email the RA account for your more individual response. There's a question regarding the recording of this presentation. The recording of this presentation will be made available on the patent website. I can't say immediately, but we do have a pretty fast turnaround. So we will get this prepared and on the patent website as quickly as we can. Well, I really thank everybody for joining us today. I'm hoping this provided some clarity to this very important decision-making point that parents need to make. And I really am looking forward to the start of the school year and getting back to something a little bit more familiar, and I hope you are too. So do not hesitate to reach out to the Bureau through that RA account if you have any additional questions or concerns, and we will continue to try to be as responsive as possible. Okay, so this concludes our presentation. Take care, everybody.